Hi, I'm Susanna and this is my June reading wrap-up, including a summer reading vlog and a book haul. I finished 9 books in June, including these 6. Let's start with Song of Silver, Flame Like Night by Amélie Wen Zhao. This is a young adult fantasy. For years, the Hin kingdom has been occupied by the Elansians, a metal magic wielding nation determined to destroy the Hin culture. 18-year-old Lan entertains the occupiers by night and by day scavenges the remnants of the past for anything that might help her understand the mysterious mark her mother left her right before she died. She meets Zen, a practitioner of forbidden Hin magic who saves her life and teaches her to use magic. Together they hold the power to liberate their land or to destroy it. Song of Silver, Flame Like Night is the first book in a young adult fantasy duology, Song of the Last Kingdom. I enjoyed the story and thought that the description of colonialism and oppression was well done, but there were a few things that stopped me from giving this book 5 stars. The text was slow to read and especially the first half of the book was full of exposition that was done in a clumsy and info-dumpy manner. The world building was intricate and detailed and the magic system was literally magical. However, I did have a few issues with the world building. The Elansian magic system never felt as fully developed as the Hin system, which might be due to the point of view characters not fully understanding how it works. A bigger issue for me was the Hin culture and history. It's clearly influenced by Chinese history, culture and literature, and there were a lot of allusions and references that even I, who has a limited knowledge of Chinese history and culture, could pick up. The world felt like alternate universe China with added fantasy elements. Personally, I found that distracting as I felt I was constantly juggling between the real world and the story world. I guess I prefer my fantasy worlds 1 or 2 steps further removed from the real world, but I'm sure that's just my personal preference. Besides the writing and the world building, the third thing I felt iffy about was Lan's character. She is a determined and feisty girl who learns to use her powers. Nothing wrong with that, I love strong female characters. The problem is that too many, especially young adult books, have a female main character exactly like her. I cannot think of a single thing that would set her apart from so many other young adult heroines. That's really unfortunate because I do enjoy characters like her. I just wish there had been something more in Lan. Now, I don't usually enjoy morally grey characters because moral greyness is usually just an excuse for characters to act like assholes. For Zan, however, it worked. I think it was because deep down he was a likable character to whom bad things had happened. I understood why he made the decisions he made and his gradual descent to the dark side made sense. This book is a perfect example of a corruption arc done right. But I do hope that in the second book of the duology he gets a redemption arc. Despite my misgivings, I definitely want to continue with this series. I'm giving this book 4 stars and I would recommend it to anyone who likes young adult fantasy. Maybe the things that bothered me won't bother you. I also finished another fantasy book, The Final Strife by Sarah L. Arifi. But since I read the majority of this book in May, I've already reviewed this book in my May reading wrap-up. You can find my May reading wrap-up here or in the description. In June, I also finally finished the collected ancient Greek novels. This volume includes English translations of 9 complete prose narratives and several fragments commonly included in the genre of ancient Greek novels. These texts were written in the 1st century's Common Era. I love the ancient Greek prose narratives, especially the 5 Romance novels. And I highly recommend this edition if you want to learn more about the ancient Greek novels. This book includes the 5 Romance novels and some other texts, including Lucian's A True Story, which is probably the first science fiction or fantasy novel ever, and Alexander Romance, which is a historical fiction about Alexander the Great. I have a longer review of this book in my blog if you want to learn more about the texts in this collection. The link is in the description. I also finished 3 non-fiction books. The first was I Speak You Are, A History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard. This book gives a broad strokes view of Roman history from the founding of Rome, which is traditionally dated to 753 BCE, to Caracalla's edict that made all free men Roman citizens in 212 CE. This was a fascinating take on Roman history, but definitely not a book for someone with no prior knowledge of the topic. The book expects the reader to be familiar with at least the basic facts. The text doesn't always follow the chronological order of events, which makes it difficult to follow. For that reason, I would only recommend this book to Roman history nerds. I also read a non-fiction book about the year in the medieval Finland. And I flipped through an old geometry book. I'm not going to rate this book, but I'm going to count it as read. After finishing all these books, I went on a little summer vacation and visited my mother. During that time, I took the opportunity to pick up books from her bookshelf. This was the collection I could choose from. As you can see, the love of books runs in the family. The first book I picked was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This was my third Steinbeck and honestly probably the last, at least for a while. I like Steinbeck's writing, but I find his stories too depressing. East of Eden tells the story of 3 generations of 2 families, the Hamiltons and the Trasks, and includes real-life events from Steinbeck's childhood. Samuel Hamilton was his maternal grandfather. The title of the book refers to the biblical narrative of Cain and Abel, and sibling rivalry and either attempted or metaphorical fratricide are major themes in the novel. It was interesting to notice all the allusions to the Genesis narrative of Adam and Eve and their sons, but at the same time I found the biblical allusions heavy-handed. In addition, the character of Kathy/Kate was too one-sidedly evil to be believable. That being said, East of Eden is definitely a classic worth reading, but it's not my favorite Steinbeck. I gave this book 4 stars. The next book I picked up from my mother's shelves was Tove Jansson's Sculptor's Daughter. Jansson is more famous for her movement books, but I have to admit that I've never been a huge fan of them, which feels a little sacrilegious to say as a Finn. But I enjoyed Jansson's The Summer book when I read it a few years ago, and Sculptor's Daughter was great as well. The book is a collection of short autobiographical snippets from Tove's childhood. Her father worked as a sculptor and her mother illustrated book covers, and in addition Jansson writes about her summers with her parents and grandparents, her impressions of adults as a child, and her childhood plays. I loved how she perfectly captures the innocence and naivety of a child in her writing. 5 stars and a book I highly recommend. I had time for a third book as well, and I picked up a little collection of 3 short stories by Russian author Anton Chekhov. I've read Chekhov's plays before and really enjoyed them. I'm not sure if I've read any of Chekhov's short stories before, but I was a little disappointed with this collection. The first story in this collection was My Life, a novella about a young aristocratic man who doesn't want a menial job in an office, but instead wants to make a living with his hands. His father disowns him and he takes up a job as a painter and later, influenced by a woman he marries, as a farmer. His rejection of aristocratic lifestyle leads to a family tragedy as his sister starts an affair with a married man and ends up pregnant out of wedlock. This was a slow narrative where almost nothing happens and I didn't particularly enjoy it. The Lady with the Dog is a short story about an adulterous affair between an unhappily married Moscow banker and a young married woman that begins while both are vacationing in Yalta. I found it hard to relate to the characters as the narrative didn't give clear reasons why they were attracted to each other and started the affair in the first place. The third story in the collection, In the Ravine, is a novelette about a merchant family living in a rural Russian village. The aging merchant Grigory Chibukin decides to marry his elder son Anisim to a poor young woman. Anisim agrees to the wedding without enthusiasm and comes home with newly minted coins that later turn out to be fake. Anisim's forgery is caught and he is sent to 6 years of hard labor in Siberia. Chibukin makes a will that gives his fortune to Anisim's newborn son. This angers the wife of Chibukin's younger son and she pours boiling water on the baby, killing him. This is a tragic and powerful story, but ultimately I found its pessimism depressing. All in all, I gave this collection 3 stars. And then it was time to do some book shopping. So here are the books I picked up from the bookstore. First, a fantasy duology, Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. I've been wanting to read this duology for a long time. I also picked up the third book of Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy by Stephanie Garber, A Curse for True Love, and the second book in the Ending Fire trilogy by Sara El Arifi, The Battle Drum. The first book of this trilogy, The Final Strife, I read in May. And the final book I picked up is Agatha Christie's A Murder is Announced. One of the books I picked up in the bookstore, Agatha Christie's A Murder is Announced, I actually started reading in the train on the way back home. Technically I finished this book in July, but I'll review it now when it's fresh in my mind. The time and the place of a murder is announced in a local village newspaper, and naturally the curious neighbors flock into the house, hoping for an entertaining night. But when the murder really happens, excitement turns to fear, and soon, it seems, no one is safe. A Murder is Announced is part of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple series. This was my first time reading about the sweet old sleuth. The murder mystery was great and I could not figure out who the murderer was. However, I don't think this is a good introduction to Miss Marple. For the most of the book, she isn't even present, and the majority of the investigation is handled by an adequate but not particularly fascinating police officer. And that's the reason why I'm giving this book 4 stars instead of 5. And that's all of the books I read in June. July is the month of the Jane Austen July Readathon. This is my second year of taking part in it, and I'm super excited. I've made a separate video about all the books I'm planning to read during Jane Austen July. You can find the video here or in the description. Let me know in the comments what was your favorite read in June and whether you're planning to take part in Jane Austen July. And I'll see you in my next video.